Good morning in Hong Kong and WA, and good afternoon to everyone in Australia and New Zealand. My name is Christelle Cochico, and I'll be your webinar facilitator today. Before we get into the key updates for the Asia to ANZ trade lane, let me go through some housekeeping rules, as well as spend a few moments with you introducing our guest speakers and our panelists. Firstly, please input all your questions in the chat box below, and we will go through them during the Q&A session. Secondly, take a few moments to complete the feedback survey from the webinar. We value your feedback, and we use it to improve our future webinars. Thirdly, a recording of this webinar will be distributed via email to you by the end of this week. Please reach out if you don't receive it. And lastly, if you have any questions after the webinar, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We are fortunate to welcome a host of guest speakers and panelists covering a range of perspectives, from shipping lines, origin offices in Asia, as well as both local offices in Australia and New Zealand. First up, I'm pleased to introduce Anthony O'Goul, General Manager of Asia ANZ Lines at A&L Containerline. He has worked with A&L for the past 25 years, including 5 years in Hong Kong as A&L's Regional Manager for Asia, and for the last 3 years as General Manager for A&L's Asia and Oceania services. Anthony is here to provide an insight into the perspective of shipping lines. We also welcome Phil Bramwell, Director, based in our Mondial VGL New Zealand office. Phil heads up all business from Asia to New Zealand, and he is here to provide a brief global trends update in our industry, share some insight on the dire challenges that New Zealand is facing at the moment. Our next guest speaker is Roberto Cayulo from our Mondial VGL Hong Kong office. Roberto will be providing insight into origin offices in Asia. And last but not the least, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists from our local offices here in Australia and New Zealand, who will be assisting us during the Q&A session later on. We have Brodie Collins, General Manager of Forwarding, based in our Sydney office, as well as Gerard Morrison, Chief Operating Officer, based in our Auckland office. As you can see, we have a full house of experts today. Welcome, everyone. So first up, I will pass you on to Phil now, who will provide an update on global trends. He will then be followed by Anthony and Roberto to provide the key updates for the Asia to ANZ trade lane. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal, and welcome to everybody to this webinar, and thanks very much for joining us. So I'm just going to cover off today what's happening in terms of the global supply chain and shipping world, and then I'm just going to, at the end, just give you a brief update on the challenges that we face in terms of the New Zealand trade. So if we just look at the first graph that I've got here, is global shipping costs have gone up substantially. In general, they're about just over 300% up. And the increases vary from market to market. So the biggest actual increases in freight costs have been on the east-west trades, which are the biggest trades, which is from Asia into the USA and Asia into Europe, where we've seen the largest increases. To give you an idea, on some of those trade lanes, the shipping rates are getting up to around about $20,000 a 40-foot container. So the next graph is, apologies, it looks fairly complicated, and it's actually got nothing to do with shipping. It's just tells us what's actually going on in terms of the manufacturing supply on a global basis, the Purchasing Manager Index. So these are global graphs and explain what's occurring in the global supply chain. So what we're seeing is that all the factories around the world are at full capacity. They're at record levels. And you look at that's the graph in the middle, and on the one on the left, what we're seeing is the backlog of work at all these factories is growing and growing. And the graph on the right, what we're also seeing is sort of following on from all this is the lead times are getting a lot longer. So the World Trade Organization is sort of predicting about an 8% pickup in merchandise trade for this year. And the backlog of production upstream factories is rising to record levels, driven by the demand surges of raw material supplies. So in terms of what that's flowing onto is the next one, which is just the throughput. So the global throughput through all the ports is well up, and it varies from country to country. So biggest actual increase in terms of port throughput is actually in the American trade, where we've seen it's been the retail trade into America has been booming since the COVID pandemic. So now if we just drill down to what's actually happening in terms of New Zealand, we've got all these global issues going on. We've also got a huge problem in terms of port congestion. So what we're seeing in the New Zealand market is all our ports are heavily congested. Littleton, Napier, Tauranga, and most importantly and notably is Auckland. So about 70% of the imports for New Zealand come into Auckland, and it's serviced by Tauranga to a lesser degree, and then Auckland is the main port. It's been fairly well publicised. The Auckland port's got a lot of problems with an automation project they're trying to introduce, but also very much a staff shortage. So what we're seeing was we're normally used to about 150 vessels a quarter coming in through the ports of Auckland. That's down to 80 visits a quarter. And what that corresponds is that the amount of containers that are coming into or able to come through Auckland is actually decreased by about the same amount. So what does all that flow onto? And that's the next graph. So what we're seeing is we're used to having weekly services from all trades, but what we're seeing, we've got vessel sliding, bunching and blanking. So like this is just an example. It's probably one of the worst examples we've seen, but on this particular service from China into Auckland, we're used to a weekly service and a weekly allocation of space, but for the month of June, we actually only end up with one sailing. And what that means is the whole market is down to like 25% capacity for that one service. So it's a huge decrease. So the demand is significantly increasing and the supply is drastically decreasing. So, which is why we've got the problems that we've got in terms of New Zealand at the moment.
Thank you, Phil. Over now to you to Anthony and Roberto to give us an update on Asia to ANZ trade lane, please.
Thank you. And firstly, thanks for the opportunity to participate in today's webinar on the Asia and New Zealand trade lane update. All industries involved in the supply chain are facing difficult and unprecedented challenges since the onset of COVID, and I'm happy to be involved and provide some feedback from a carrier's perspective. First of all, we'll go through a little bit on the volume, and these graphs are showing the total imports per month since 2018 into Australia from both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. They're from the Australian port stats, which we do find quite accurate. Pay your attention to the evolution of last year, which is the green bars, and this year's, which is the purple. And you can see quite clearly the initial reductions after the onset of COVID, with China first going into lockdown. However, you can see that there was a very strong push from June, particularly where there was a spike to really record levels. And we've seen that those sorts of volumes have remained that way ever since. So as far as the growth year on year in terms of volumes into Australia, for Northeast Asia, we're seeing a very large growth, 41%, keeping in mind that it does include the COVID impact last year, as well as for Southeast Asia, subcontinent and Middle East Gulf has increased by around 19%. Roberto, do you have any comments as far as the Australia volumes are concerned?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. The graph is actually pretty much clear, but it doesn't tell actually the full story. So what we see on the purple side of the graph, talking about February and March in particular, is something that is coming from the previous peak season. So what it's not telling is that it's a long way coming from September, October, November, where we had no chance to ship actually all the demand. What do we see in February, March? We should put in, and consider like probably a peak season volume just ahead of the demand. And supply started again March after Chinese New Year stopped. And we can see it's pretty much consistent in April and May. And this is totally, and maybe you can confirm it was totally unexpected because everybody was having a different conversation and talking for the allocation in the new year in January, February. So this is something to take in consideration, especially when maybe later on we talk about the forecast for 2022 and maybe even after.
Thanks, Roberto. As far as New Zealand's concerned, we do struggle a little bit with the stats, to be frank. We don't have the benefit of the port stats. So the stats you're seeing there are from the container trade statistics, which are referred to as CTS. We've only got them up through till February at this stage, and it's showing just some small growth, 8% for Southeast Asia, ISC and the Middle East Gulf, and only a small growth for Northeast Asia. However, and I guess it's in line with Phil's comments before, we certainly are still seeing some very severe base shortages in New Zealand. Relates more so to the limited number of voyages due to the slides and the blankings that are taking place for various reasons, which we'll discuss, and that's limiting the capacity into New Zealand. They're the main issues, and to be frank, while we continue to have these issues from an operational standpoint as far as these slides and blankings, etc., we do anticipate that the demand for space will be extremely strong all the way through into next year. Excuse me for the colourful graphs are a little bit hard to read, but what they're trying to represent is essentially what the supply and demand is per month on both the North East Asia and Southeast Asia trade lanes to Australia. Again, because of the statistical information that's not really available for New Zealand, it's a little bit harder for us to manage or to measure it from a New Zealand standpoint. The green bar represents the demand, and the coloured squares are what we understand was the weekly capacity for each consortium during those periods. And no surprise that we're seeing very strong utilisations year to date. As mentioned in the volume slide, we're seeing record volumes moving each month, and there is a requirement for additional capacity to be introduced. There's a limited ship availability, so it's very difficult for us to manage the additional demand that's there for us. Charter market, which we'll go into, is very limited in terms of availability, and carriers are now looking to secure ships through second-hand vessel markets or through new buildings. Unfortunately, in some cases, due to the limited vessel carriers having to blank rather than replace vessels when vessels need to go into dry dock. So this creates a snowballing effect in terms of demand on space. We anticipate that this will continue while the big east-west trades remain very strong. Just to demonstrate in terms of the growth on the trans-Pacific trades from China to US, there's been a year-on-year growth of 48%. And that's expected to continue. So while there's a lot of heat in terms of volumes on the big east-west trades, that'll see an impact as well on our trades. But I'm not sure if you've got any comments specifically around the space.
Well, I just add a few things compared to last year. And this is respect with the coming peak season. We are already in July talking about next period, which is just behind us and in front of us. And actually last year we had peak season service. Actually, it was a CMA to deploy fortnightly service from Northeast Asia to Australia. This year, we're not going to have any peak season service already confirmed by CMA, unfortunately, and any other carrier is. Everybody is trying to increase the presence in Asia, but they simply don't have any chance to find a suitable vessel. We only had an extra loader actually this month. We are talking about a vessel with 850 TEUs deployed, which is basically nothing into this trade lane. It was for New Zealand. So talking about the future, I don't see really something coming to help the situation. Not a peak season service. Certainly some extra loaders and certainly some relocation vessel moving up and down to different trade lanes. So we're going to use the little corner that will be open to us just to help the situation and help the customer to take up some cargo from the warehouses in China and help the situation at origin, basically. This is in general not looking very good for the next peak season. So it's going to be very tough season as well. That seems, if not worse than last year.
Yeah, and I guess just to expand on your point, the CMA service you're talking about is one that I'm specifically involved in, and it was our intention to add capacity in the peak without question, but because of limited vessels, we haven't been able to achieve that, even though our consortium partners are fully on board as well. So it's a battle, and what we're seeing is the impact on the charter market. We've mentioned the general shortage in the charter market, and with the strong demand for vessels, owners are taking the opportunity to maximise charter rates. With increases significantly, you can see there on the table the comparison between the cost, the daily charter rate that's been paid by the lines, and I've included the size of the vessels that we use primarily on the Oceania trades, the Panamax 4250s, 6000s, and the bigger ones of 8500s that we also operate. And you can see there that the cost to the line is substantially increased year on year. And I guess what's also important to note, concern from a carrier's perspective, is the extended term of the fixtures. A year ago, we were generally fixing our ships for 12 months, while now the owners of the ships are pushing for these fixtures to be extended through to 3 years, in some cases 3 to 5 years. So from a carrier's perspective, it's obviously a big concern, significant increase in cost that will be be taking on board a long time with not a really clear understanding of what the trade is going to look like in a couple of years' time. So certainly there's an exposure there from a carrier's perspective. As far as the other important asset is equipment, and there's a big shortage of equipment across the industry right now because of the heavy demand we're seeing that we've spoken about. As a general comment, carriers are usually looking at about 50% of their fleet to be available on the ground at any given time. However, currently we're probably sitting around 60 to 70% of the equipment being utilised at any given time. So while the investment of new equipment is in place, the delivery of those new boxes certainly take time to flow through into the fleet. And it's also worth noting that there are some cases of an internal competition really for equipment, and equipment being received for those trades that are actually generating the most profits. All efforts are being made, certainly from our side as far as ANL and CMA are concerned, but I know other carriers as well, in terms of really pushing to turn boxes around as quickly as possible, while at the same time, while there are some shortages, we are looking to substitute wherever we can into 20 footers. And also non-operating reefers wherever we can. Roberto, I know you're on the ground over there, so you might have some comments locally about some of the key areas.
Certainly, equipment shortage is becoming actually the main issue here in China or in Asia, specifically in Indonesia, and it is something we are facing since the last peak season. We thought that would be addressed by the line in 2001, but unfortunately, we are again at the same point of last year. As you said, it's an internal war, if you allow me to use the word, between trade lanes into the same. If a container can provide a much better profitability for the USA trade lane or the European trade lane, it's just simply diverted to those trade lanes. And for us, into intra-Asia market or Oceania market, and it's more and more difficult every week to find the entire stock to provide to the supplier. So as you can see from the graph, China is basically a red point for everything. Right now, we are pretty much okay with the 20s. And I would say 20 average, they are available, but certainly not everywhere, only in some direct ports. Or any kind of 40s, they are in shortages pretty much. It's a war every day to collect the equipment from the terminal. I would say that the suppliers also, they are in a tough situation everywhere in China. Is all the system is making all the difficulties for them to collect the equipment from the terminal. Don't forget that right now we have, specifically in the south, with the COVID in Yantian, with COVID case in Yantian, very precise in organization, and the suppliers have to print the equipment that's in interchange receipt just 6 days before the ETD, and have 3 days or 4 days, it depends by the carrier, to collect the equipment, stuff the cargo, and deliver the containers back to the terminal for the vessel to come. Very short time for them to do everything. And both Shekau and Yantian, actually, they have implemented a series of limited number of slots available per day. Still last week, we were working at 6,000 slots per day. So if you weren't fast enough to print your receipt before anybody else, then you basically lose a day, and you risk, after you lose 3 days, basically you risk the option to ship the cargo. So it's a series of things that people ask to our company, suppliers have to overcome actually in order to load the cargo. Shortage of containers is becoming the number one worry. Unfortunately, we don't see anything, coming back to China to help the situation. Actually, we are hoping that the USA trade lane, the European trade lane, they calm down a little bit, and that's the only option we have to see some supply back to China, and they can be utilized again for Oceania market.
And the congestion is not helping the equipment situation, Roberto. I haven't included the US on this slide, but to make the point that on the West Coast, there's vessels being held up by 14 days, 21 days with lots of boxes sitting on it, and it just slows the whole process in terms of turning those boxes around. There has been severe disruption to all services for the last 12 months. We've obviously all heard about the recent Suez Canal incident, which had a flow-on effect on all of our Southeast Asia hubs, being Singapore, Port Kelang, and Tanjung Pelepas. There's obviously been that recent COVID square in Yantian, which caused some major disruption to services calling the Yantian and the South China ports. And we're seeing a consequence currently actually in Hong Kong, where we're being held up by 10 days at different times and having to take decisions to omit Hong Kong. Some major issues. Phil touched on the issues in Auckland, and certainly it's having an impact on services, and seen in the previous slide, limiting the number of calls in the overall space. The rollout of their automation plan certainly been an interruption, and also, there's been some unfortunate incidents, not allowed skilled labour to be coming through COVID restrictions. This has resulted in the berthing windows being abolished, with heavy delays to vessel operators, and this has led to the Port of Auckland implementing move count restrictions, which has led to further congestion within both the terminal in Auckland, but also, importantly, the depots have also had some congestion there. So certainly the full supply chain has got some challenges. And finally, I guess it all has a final impact on the actual schedule reliability that's being offered. To explain the graphs, they're showing the on-time performance, plus or minus 24 hours is considered on-time. For Asia trade lanes to both Australia and New Zealand, and the coloured lines represent different services. So they're not just our own services, but also our competitors. And as demonstrated, we're experiencing similar issues. Poor performance, unfortunately, over the last 12 months, and it's something that, from a carrier perspective, we're not at all happy about. And I spend way too much of my time looking at schedules every day. We've had a number of different issues that have created the situation we find ourselves in. Obviously, with the COVID cases, crew change, disruptions, where we've had to deviate in order to proceed with crew changes, or we've had cases on board. With the growth in volumes comes larger exchanges, so longer time in port. Unfortunately, in Australia, we still continue to wrestle with the protected industrial action, particularly currently in Patrick's, which is causing issues. We've touched on the congestion and the issues in Auckland. One thing just to note, as a small positive, you'll see on the Australia slides, the ones on the left, that there's been an uptick in the improvement on schedule reliability, and we do hope that will continue to show a positive upward trend. DP World are operating better, and they don't have their issues with the MUA. VICT have just reached agreement, so it's really the services calling Patrick's that are likely to still have some issues moving forward. Certainly, rest assured that from a carrier's perspective, we're not at all satisfied with the schedule reliability that is on offer. We're looking at finding whatever ways we can to try and improve the situation. From a carrier side, as far as the solutions, I guess it's all about investment. Due to the extended periods of poor results, carriers haven't been able to sufficiently invest in the infrastructure, which I think is one of the reasons we're facing the challenges today. It's certainly not the only reason, but it is one of the issues. There's certainly a strong focus now on investing, both in terms of vessels and equipment, to ensure we're better prepared for the future growth moving forward. It's certainly our view that maintaining a carrier sustainability is imperative to ensure the continued improvements, investments in the future, which will ultimately ensure improvements. And from a freight forwarding side, Brodie?
Thank you, Anthony. Obviously, we've heard today of the continued challenges in the supply chain as a result of the increased demand and the capacity challenges. What we do encourage you is to continue that collaboration with your Mondial VGL representative here locally in Australia and New Zealand, and also with suppliers on the ground at origin. If we're doing that, we can obviously look at options, alternative options. They are changing every week depending on equipment availability, changes with extra loaders or peak season services. We are looking at alternative load ports for some of your shippers in terms of Shenzhen area, where we're having still a backlog because of the COVID situation. If you're looking at what you're utilising in the container is another solution, so that we can obviously maximise the containers, have a reduced pressure on the container equipment availability. As we've seen and what Roberto spoke to, China in particular with the equipment challenges, if you can look at using alternative equipment types, this can also reduce the pressure on the equipment availability. If you're looking at managing expectations in your businesses, we are encouraging people to extend lead time from production to delivery where possible. We appreciate that can be challenging from a supplier side if goods are already available at the factory at origin. So really looking at the cargo ready date through to delivery, because as we've seen from the earlier slides and what the speakers have been talking about, there are challenges with the regular services that we're used to. So a regular review of your lead times in your ERP systems and regarding sales expectations, just to manage that all the way through to delivery. If we're smoothing our weekly volumes that we're requiring from our origin offices and origin ports, that of course helps when we are talking about reduced allocations, we're talking about reduced services, so we're smoothing out. If you're smoothing out what you're requiring at origin, obviously that does help in terms of weekly services with the shipping lines. If we're planning time-sensitive cargo, promotional orders or critical orders, we still recommend that you're looking at direct services just to minimise that impact or potential delay in transshipment ports. These would be our solutions, and also communication is key, and we will continue to support you wherever possible.
Thank you. Thanks, Brody. Thank you, Anthony. Let's now delve into our Q&A session. First, we will go through the questions that we received during the registration phase. And whilst we do, if you have any questions that you'd like to be answered in real time, live right now, please enter them in the Q&A box below. Our first question is from Victoria. She's asking, what is currently the lead time for sea and air freight from Asia? This one's for you, Roberto.
Thank you. Asia is a big region, so it's a little bit, probably I would say we have no problem for air freight anywhere in Asia. So direct flight from Beijing, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Shanghai, as well as Singapore. We can reach a destination between 3 to 5 days as a lead time. So talking about sea freight, I would say consider at least 1 week to 4 weeks on top of the standard lead time. So whatever you had before as a normal situation, now we are talking about 1 to 4 weeks. If you use a Singapore service, for example, for whatever reason, shipment to New Zealand or for West Coast, you have at least 4 days waiting time in Singapore before you get a connection and the total lead time.
Thank you. Thanks, Roberto. Our next question is also for you, if you don't mind helping us out with it. How can we get bookings ahead of time?
Ahead of time is something we are working right now on the provisional basis. So we work for forecast. We require all the suppliers to book with us at least 2, most of the time 3 weeks before. And we push the line to release the shipping order as soon as possible. And considering the congestion they have right now and the equipment management they are under right now, we normally get the shipping order from the lines 7 to 6 days before the ETD. And once we get a shipping order, the suppliers are forced to actually print an interchange receipt. The shipping order is not the solution, to the last solution. You still have to find the equipment. I mean, it means you need to have an interchange receipt print from the system in order to try and find an equipment on the terminal. Right now, actually, there is no extra free time anymore, so no facility anymore. Everything is, just in time. You have to wake up in the morning and keep pushing the lines, operators of the terminal, to give you what you need to collect the equipment. Aside all these activities, there's not much to do with.
Thank you, Roberto. Our next question is from Courtney. When do you anticipate the market to return to normal conditions? Don't we all want to know that? Anthony and Phil, did you want to help us with this question?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really good question, but it is really a difficult one to answer with any certainty. There are a number of drivers here, so it's difficult to determine when normal conditions will return if we understand what. As far as we can see, we'll continue to see a strong demand on consumer goods, while the service industry such as travel is impacted by lockdown. So for the short term, we anticipate volumes to remain really strong while the lockdowns continue around the world. And we've also seen a shift in buying patterns from just in time to just in case. So with this change, we'll continue to see a pressure on the supply chain. At least that's how we see it. As far as capacity is concerned, it'll take time for those new buildings to come through and be available. In the short term, the supply part of the equation can only be resolved once we can limit the number of blankings and slides. So really, it's up to making sure that the operation side of the business is resolved to somewhat. I don't think normal will return this year. It's not what we anticipate. Certainly from a volume perspective, all the way through to Chinese New Year next year, we're expecting to see a very strong demand pattern with ships essentially full and rolling. So really, that's where we see it from the carrier side. Phil, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add from your side.
No, I 100% agree with that. I think it's at least sort of eight months away before we see any light at the end of the tunnel. Even that is just purely a guess in terms of, I mean, most of our clients just, as I say, their order books are all full, a huge rolling pool. So, I mean, this year will definitely be at capacity for the rest of this year and leading up to Chinese New Year next year.
Thanks, Phil. Our next question is from Jeremy. He's asking, as we approach what is typically peak season, where do you see lead times and costs in New Zealand between now and January? Is this something you can help us with, Phil?
So normally, like in April, May, we're sort of normally seeing vessels sort of 60% full. Now we're already at full capacity, and we've got rolling pools. So I mean, it's very highly likely that we'll be having at least monthly increases in shipping costs. So I think you really have to budget for further increases this year, and likely to be monthly.
Our next question is from John. He's asking, the current SCFI has reached peak 2020 figures and looks to hit $10,000 per TEU by week 40. How likely is this, or will carriers hold back? Anthony, can you help us with this one?
I think Roberto touched on it before on this point in terms of the competition amongst the lines. The carriers aren't only just competing against each other, but internally there is a bit of a competition for equipment and as well as a capacity as well. So, on the basis that other trades remain buoyant and achieving strong profits and increasing rates on a monthly basis, I'd expect that the rates to increase further to both Australia and New Zealand as well. This will ensure that we can still be relevant and ensure that we can secure equipment, which is most important. There's also other costs for consideration. Our feeder costs with third parties is going up as well at very high levels. So that's also a consideration. But certainly in terms of making sure that we can secure the equipment that's needed, it's important that we can compete with the other trade lanes.
Thank you, Anthony. I have another question for you. It's from Marie. She's asking, what is being done to increase available shipping capacity over the coming months?
Well, we've touched on the capacity side as far as new buildings and second-hand vessel market, which is the two clear ones. As far as the new building side of things, and certainly from CMA CGM Group's perspective, they've placed a large number of orders. In reality, it does take time for these to start working through the system. We will see those coming through, but not in the short term. I think probably what we will see though in the short term is in Auckland, whereby they're making some changes and reducing that automation because of some of the incidents that have taken place and increasing the manual operation. We're quite positive that'll see an immediate impact and increase the capacity that's being deployed currently, and hopefully not see as many blankings, slides that we're currently seeing in Auckland. So for me, that would be the most likely short-term positive outcome as far as capacity is concerned.
Thanks, Anthony. I have a question for Gerard. What are the pros and cons of shipping through Marsden Point versus Auckland versus Tauranga ports? Can you help us with that, please?
Well, Crystal, I can try, and thanks for the question, Doug. Look, it's a difficult one to answer, and that not trying to avoid the question. I think there are definitely pros and cons for each of those ports. However, sometimes those pros and cons for each of those ports can change quite regularly, depending on the situation and the rest of the connected supply chain around them. So a difficult one to answer specifically.
Thanks, Gerard. Our next question is for Phil. Is bulk cargo under less pressure than containerised shipping?
Yes. So most of the problems that we're having is to do with containerised cargo. In general, the bulk cargo has been affected, but not to the same degree as containerisation.
And the next question is for you, Phil, again. It's from Austin. He's asking, are the issues ex-Asia to New Zealand and Australia like those experienced in Asia to UK?
Most definitely. I mean, the UK has actually been one of the most affected markets, the spot market rate, and there is it's been sort of over 15,000 US for quite some time, which is it's had one of the biggest increases on the global stage in terms of shipping costs.
Thank you, Phil. Our next question is for Brodie from Dali. I do note that Alexander also posted a question live in our Q&A, so it's a very similar question. Do we see an end to this? Is there anything that Mondial, VGL and us as customers, what can we do to alleviate this for us, for everyone?
Thanks, Alexander and Dali, for the questions. Obviously, a very important one. As we've heard today, unfortunately, in the short term, we don't see an end to the current situation that we're working through. We do, however, we'll keep you updated in regards to additional capacity that comes in, alternative solutions. We do still highly recommend, as we spoke through before, Anthony and myself, the solutions around reviewing what's coming into the trade, communicating with your Mondial VGL representative and working with your suppliers to understand options at origin for alternative options.
Great, thank you, Brodie. I do note that we have about 12 questions on our Q&A question box. I'm just very conscious of time. It's 12:43. We should be finished at absolute 12:45 today, unfortunately. So what I can do is I'll just quickly, maybe we have time for just one more question. So Nigel Coleman's asking, what exactly is causing the increased demand since COVID? I think a lot of that is the online shopping, isn't it? I think, Phil, you covered the manufacturing output in your presentation, and I think it's just people buying and ordering a lot more than usual.
Yes, most definitely. I mean, you look at the retail spending in the States, something up like 40%. Obviously, people aren't traveling, so they're just spending their time at home and improving their homes. And that hasn't really slowed down at all.
So I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for coming and joining us today. Hope it's been very helpful and useful for you with all the information that we've shared today. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to contact your local Mondial VGL representative. And I guess just have a great day. And thank you again, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.